In today's video, we'll uncover a chilling psychological trap faced by intuitive introverts, those rare individuals who sense more, dream deeper, and think further than the world allows. But with that gift comes a danger no one talks about, and it's already consuming those who don't recognize the warning signs. Intuition is often romanticized. It is painted as a mystic power, something divine, ancient, and untouchable. The world praises those who can predict what others do not yet see, who sense the mood of a room without a word spoken, who navigate relationships, decisions, and meaning through a silent and inner knowing. This inner knowing feels like magic, and to the intuitive individual, it often seems like a compass pointing toward invisible truths. But this gift is not pure light. In its very structure lies a deep and often misunderstood shadow. The intuitive type lives not in the now, but in the potential. They do not see objects, they see possibilities. They do not follow linear paths, they leap between patterns and symbols. Where most people rely on evidence, intuition speaks in metaphors, emotions, and sudden images that appear in the mind like whispers from another realm. This can give rise to great insight, but also opens a door that logic cannot close: the risk of detaching from what is real. For the intuitive, what is real is rarely enough. The concrete, the measurable, the observable, all of these things feel limited, even oppressive. The physical world begins to feel like a cage, or at best, a poor reflection of the deeper world within. In childhood, this may manifest as a fascination with imagination, storytelling, or mystical thinking. As one matures, it may evolve into philosophical longing, prophetic reflection, or spiritual isolation. The individual walks through life not entirely here, but never fully elsewhere either. This disconnection from the tangible world may not be immediately visible. In fact, it may be disguised as creativity, introspection, or intelligence. But beneath it all is a creeping erosion of groundedness. The intuitive person can begin to ignore the simple truths of life, that the body must be cared for, that time must be managed, that relationships need practical maintenance. Life becomes a series of internal movies, playing endlessly in the mind. Some inspiring, others disturbing, but all of them more compelling than the moment at hand. What makes this even more dangerous is the seductive nature of intuition. It is deeply validating. When your instincts about people, events, or ideas prove correct, you begin to trust that inner voice with religious intensity. You learn to silence doubt, even when it's necessary. You begin to resist feedback, structure, and systems, because they feel like cages to your flow. But this is where the shadow grows. In avoiding what feels rigid, the intuitive risks becoming unmoored. No schedule, no structure, no routine, only drifting from insight to insight, while the world around them begins to rot or retreat. This erosion is not just social or practical, it is also psychological. The more one lives in the internal world of images, impressions, and intuitive leaps, the more vulnerable one becomes to distortion. You begin to assign meaning where there is none. You start to connect events that are unrelated. You see symbols and patterns that were never placed by fate or destiny, but only by your desire for deeper meaning. Intuition, when unbalanced, becomes delusion. You stop observing and start projecting. Every glance becomes a sign. Every coincidence becomes fate. Every feeling becomes a truth. And before long, you no longer live in the world. You live in a myth you constructed to protect yourself from it. The shadow deepens when the intuitive turns inward too far. In this psychological withdrawal, one is often unaware of how much is being lost. What feels like inner exploration may actually be escape. What feels like understanding may actually be isolation. The intuitive person, especially one who is introverted, begins to prefer silence to clarity, mystery to truth, and symbolism to substance. They are not running toward truth. They are running from the discomfort of being human. When this dynamic plays out over time, relationships suffer. Because to be truly known by others requires vulnerability, not just vision. It requires presence, not just insight. And many intuitive introverts struggle to allow others in, not because they are selfish or arrogant, but because they have become too identified with their inner life. They see the outer world as flawed, noisy, corrupt, and their own mind as the only sanctuary. The mind is not a sanctuary if it has no exit. It becomes a trap. The most tragic element in all this is that intuition, when rightly balanced, can be a force of light in the world. It can see through lies, awaken art, ignite change. But when turned inward without limits, it loses its light and grows dark. And this is what so many intuitive introverts do not understand. They confuse their instincts with destiny. They mistake their visions for truth. They begin to follow not reality, but the murky echoes of their own unresolved thoughts, fears, and longings. The mind becomes a forest of shadows, and every path seems both profound and perilous. Each step deeper feels like a discovery, but without grounding, there is no way to know whether one is ascending or sinking further into illusion. The gift becomes the burden. The light becomes the labyrinth. The intuitive, once full of vision, now becomes possessed by it. There is a peculiar form of suffering that does not come from being rejected, abandoned, or excluded, but from choosing solitude out of necessity and then finding that it slowly consumes the very soul that sought refuge within it. This is the paradox of isolation experienced by the intuitive introvert. The retreat into the self begins as a sanctuary, a sacred act of preservation, but what starts as protection gradually becomes a prison. The walls built to shield the inner world eventually prevent any new life from entering it. The intuitive introvert is not someone who simply enjoys being alone. They need it deeply, existentially. The world is often too loud, too fast, too artificial. The surface, level chatter of daily life grates against their deeper longing for meaning, silence, and reflection. To them, solitude is the only space where their true self can breathe. In stillness, their thoughts are sharper, their insights clearer. Alone, they feel whole. This self-imposed distance comes at a price that few understand. At first, isolation feels like liberation. No more masks, no more false conversations, no more draining social performances. Finally, one can listen to the internal voice without interruption. But the mind, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Over time, the silence that once healed begins to echo. Thoughts repeat. Memories return in cycles. Assumptions harden into beliefs. The absence of new interaction allows the internal world to become a closed system. And closed systems, without movement, begin to decay. As this solitude deepens, so does the difficulty of returning to others. The longer one stays away from people, the harder it becomes to connect when one finally desires connection. The intuitive introvert becomes increasingly alien to the social world. What once felt awkward now feels unbearable. The rules of engagement, how to converse, how to listen, how to meet someone's eyes, become foreign and even threatening. The mind begins to whisper that no one would understand anyway, that speaking would only lead to misunderstanding, that remaining alone is not only safer but truer. This belief grows slowly, quietly, like moss over stone. It's not a conscious decision, but a gradual emotional erosion. And eventually, the intuitive introvert may reach a point where they no longer even attempt connection. Not because they don't want to, but because they believe they are no longer capable of it. They have become a myth within themselves, a quiet figure that others misinterpret, avoid, or admire from afar, but never truly reach. And so, the cycle intensifies. The paradox is that the very same depth that makes the intuitive introvert crave solitude is the same force that makes their soul long for connection. They don't want crowds, but they yearn for resonance. They don't want attention, but they ache to be seen. They don't want to perform. They desperately want to be understood. And this duality of retreating for survival and suffering in the absence of intimacy creates a psychological tension that cannot be resolved by logic alone. The body begins to suffer too. The absence of touch, voice, laughter, and presence affects not just the psyche but the nervous system. Sleep changes, breathing changes. The heart becomes slower, heavier. Days blur together. The sense of time collapses. One lives more in memory than in motion, more in imagination than in actuality. The external world becomes a ghost town visited only through windows. And the internal world becomes louder, more persistent, more insistent that nothing outside is worth the risk of opening up again. When one finally dares to break the silence and re-engage with others, a strange sensation emerges: shame. Not for who one is, but for how long one has hidden. Words feel clumsy. Emotions feel fragile. Vulnerability feels like exposure to a cruel sun after living in shadows. There's an overwhelming fear of not being able to explain oneself properly, a fear that the inner world, so meticulously crafted, will be dismissed, misunderstood, or broken by another's lack of depth. But despite the discomfort, There remains a silent craving for even one moment of real connection. Single person who might understand, without explanation, the paradox of being too full of thought to speak, too emotionally aware to casually socialize, too deeply attuned to bear the shallow. And yet, this very hope, this longing for connection, becomes the most dangerous temptation, because each time it goes unmet, it reinforces the belief that solitude is the only place one can be safe from disappointment. There is also a tendency for the intuitive introvert to idolize solitude itself. Over time, isolation becomes not just a condition, but an identity. It is worn like armor. I am not meant to be with others, the mind whispers. My depth is too much for them, and soon, one's uniqueness becomes a justification for continued detachment. What was once a temporary coping mechanism now becomes a worldview, one that distorts how the individual sees others, not as allies or companions, but as intruders, distractions, or burdens. Within this framework, relationships are no longer built, they are avoided or idealized. The intuitive introvert might fantasize about perfect communion, but reject every opportunity to build it, believing no one will ever understand the complexity they carry inside. They begin to confuse the inability to connect with others as a sign of superiority rather than as a symptom of injury, and thus the cycle completes itself. The one who withdrew to preserve their soul finds that they cannot return without shattering the very identity that isolation helped them forge in the first place. The intuitive introvert often lives in a world few can see. This world is not made of objects or facts, but of images, shifting, symbolic, layered with meaning. These images emerge not from the senses, but from somewhere far deeper. They are born in the unconscious, surfacing not as deliberate thoughts, but as spontaneous visions, dreams, and emotional impressions. To the intuitive mind, these images feel more real than reality itself, and it is through them that the introvert forms their understanding of life, self, others, and purpose. Yet, what begins as a gift of deep perception can quickly become a psychological snare. The inner images, if left unchecked, begin to take over. The person no longer holds the image. The image holds the person. There is a point in the journey of many intuitive introverts when the boundary between inner and outer begins to dissolve. What exists in the mind is projected outward onto the world. People become symbols rather than individuals. Experiences become omens rather than events. Every conversation is weighed not just for what is said, but for what lies underneath. Meaning is no longer found. It is imposed. This is where the danger begins. The individual starts to relate not to reality, but to their interpretation of it, and the more emotionally charged the inner image, the more dominant it becomes. The psyche stores these images in its depths, sometimes shaped by personal trauma, ancestral memory, collective archetypes, or subconscious desires. A father's absence may evolve into a powerful inner figure of abandonment. A childhood betrayal may shape the inner image of the untrustworthy other. A spiritual vision, once glimpsed in a dream or ecstatic state, might solidify into an internal God image. These figures live in the mind, but influence behavior in the outer world. They color perception, they whisper judgments, they animate emotions, and eventually, they may overpower the ego's ability to distinguish between internal symbol and external fact. The possession occurs silently. The introvert begins to speak less from their conscious self and more from the voice of an unconscious complex. One might lash out at a friend not for what the friend did, but for what the friend represents within a deeply embedded inner narrative. A romantic partner is not seen as a human being, but as the carrier of some projected soul, image, a redeemer, a destroyer, a betrayer, a savior. And when reality fails to match the image, the introvert retreats further inward, convinced that the outer world cannot bear the truth they carry. This creates an existential tension. The person begins to prefer the inner world, not because it is safer, but because it feels more true. The outer world becomes dull, predictable, flat, but the images within are alive. They offer mystery, energy, insight. And so, the intuitive introvert becomes increasingly absorbed by their inner drama. It plays out in dreams, in fantasy, in internal dialogue. They are no longer alone. They are surrounded by figures of great emotional power. And yet, none of these figures are real in the conventional sense. They are parts of the psyche masquerading as reality. Over time, this possession leads to distortion. The introvert may develop fixed ideas about themselves, about others, about the world. These are not reasoned beliefs, but emotional convictions rooted in the imagery of the unconscious. A person may believe they are destined for greatness, not because they have evidence, but because they are possessed by the archetype of the hero. Another may feel doomed, haunted by an image of failure that replays in dreams and daydreams alike. Others may become moralists, prophets, or cynics, each identity tied to the inner figure they unknowingly serve. This psychological state is not mere imagination. It is domination. Ego becomes secondary, pushed aside by a complex that now drives perception and choice. And because the image feels sacred or profound, it is rarely questioned. To challenge it would feel like blasphemy. To discard it would mean abandoning what feels like the very core of one's identity. And so, the introvert tightens their grip, even as the image tightens its grip on them. Relationships suffer first. Others are expected to conform to the roles assigned by these inner images. If they do not, they are rejected, misunderstood, or punished. The introvert believes they are being intuitive, discerning, and insightful, but often they are simply projecting. Seeing not who someone is, who they fear or wish them to be. Reality becomes warped through this inner lens. Every disappointment reinforces the image, every conflict affirms the fantasy, and eventually, the person no longer sees the world as it is, but as a stage upon which their inner myth plays out. Work, creativity, and decision-making also become affected. The introvert may be filled with powerful inspiration, but unable to act, frozen by a sense that something must first be aligned internally. They may begin projects but never finish, consumed by the endless refinement of an inner vision. Or they may pursue goals with manic intensity, driven by a figure within who demands fulfillment, perfection, or sacrifice. Either way, the will of the ego is eroded, and the individual becomes a vessel for something ancient, unseen, and deeply personal. There is often a sense of being watched from within, of carrying a presence that judges, guides, or torments. It may appear in dreams as a wise old man, a cruel authority, a seductive muse, or a destructive shadow. These are not hallucinations. They are symbolic expressions of deep psychic content. They are the many faces of the unconscious, each demanding attention, obedience, or worship. And the more isolated the intuitive introvert becomes, the louder these figures speak. They fill the silence. They demand loyalty. They feed off attention. And soon, there is no quiet left inside, only the echoes of unexamined inner images that now rule the mind from the depths below. There is a recurring psychological pattern seen in deeply intuitive, introverted individuals. A pattern that emerges when isolation, visionary insight, and unmet emotional needs converge into something archetypal. It is not merely a behavior or a personality quirk. It is a transformation of identity, subtle at first but all-consuming in its final form. This transformation is what might be called the rise of the lone prophet, an archetypal figure that the introverted intuitive unconsciously begins to embody. The prophet, in this sense, is not religious by necessity, but symbolic. It represents a soul who has journeyed too far into the realm of the invisible, who feels burdened by a truth that others cannot see, and who, in carrying this truth alone, begins to believe it is their duty, or destiny, to stand apart from the world. The path to this identity is not chosen, it is stumbled upon. It begins with sensitivity, an ability to notice what others overlook. The intuitive introvert picks up on patterns beneath the surface, unspoken emotional shifts, or symbolic meaning hidden within ordinary experience. Over time, they begin to trust this inner vision more than any external opinion. They don't just think differently, they see differently, and when they share their perceptions, they are often met with resistance, dismissal, or ridicule. What they offer sounds too abstract, too intense, too strange. Eventually, they stop sharing altogether. This withdrawal does not come from weakness. It comes from disillusionment. The intuitive introvert begins to feel like a foreigner among their peers, someone who speaks a different language, who operates on a different frequency. They do not crave superiority, but they cannot help noticing how shallow much of modern communication feels to them. While others trade in gossip, trivialities, or surface-level observations, they remain preoccupied with meaning, direction, and existential weight. This alienation deepens until they begin to believe that perhaps they were meant to stand apart. The inner image of the lone prophet begins to take form. It begins with a quiet pride in one's ability to see through illusions, to detect truth in the chaos. But it evolves into something heavier, the belief that one must carry the burden of knowledge alone. The individual stops expecting to be understood. They stop reaching out. They become the observer of society, not its participant. They carry symbols within them, visions, insights, warnings, that feel too sacred or too dark to be shared with a world that seems asleep. This psychological stance begins to shape the ego. The introverted intuitive may begin to speak in absolutes, not out of arrogance, but out of conviction. Their truth feels earned, carved from years of inner work, solitude, and silent suffering. They are no longer just a person with ideas. They are a vessel of insight. This perception can be intoxicating, especially when one is starved for recognition, connection, or meaning. The prophet archetype becomes a mask that both empowers and isolates. It allows the individual to feel purposeful in their detachment, righteous in their distance, heroic in their loneliness. But this identity is a double-edged sword. It grants a sense of clarity, yet it conceals the very vulnerability that birthed it. Beneath the robe of the prophet is a soul that longed to be seen, to be heard, to be held without judgment. Beneath the speech of the visionary is often a cry for recognition. The archetype hardens this longing into a role, one that must be maintained at all costs. The introverted intuitive, now absorbed by this image, begins to distrust any influence that challenges it. They may reject others not because those others are shallow, but because they threaten the stability of a persona that has become too essential to abandon. The world, to the one who carries this archetype, becomes either blind or hostile. Every sign of indifference is interpreted as proof that their insight is too much for the average mind. Every disagreement feels like betrayal, and every attempt at connection becomes strained by the need to remain separate, untouched, elevated. The intuitive introvert does not just see themselves as different. They begin to believe they are fundamentally set apart. This sense of separateness creates a tragic loop. The more misunderstood they feel, the more they withdraw. The more they withdraw, the less they are understood. The prophet archetype also casts a shadow. For in believing one has access to deeper truths, there is a temptation to see others as inferior, asleep, or unworthy. The line between insight and inflation is dangerously thin. The introverted intuitive may not intend to become superior. Prolonged identification with being the one who sees breeds a subtle arrogance. Advice becomes prophecy. Intuition becomes law. Reflection becomes declaration. And soon, the internal voice is no longer questioned, no longer balanced by humility, no longer grounded in reality. It becomes the only voice that matters. Creativity, too, is shaped by this identity. The lone prophet pours their vision into art, philosophy, writing, or solitary creation. But often, this output is not shared. Or if it is done with hesitation, as if the world is not ready for the truth they possess. The work becomes a sacred offering, and rejection of it feels like rejection of the self. When others cannot understand or appreciate it, the intuitive introvert retreats further, now convinced that their vision was too pure, too deep, too ahead of its time. In private moments, they may feel the weight of this burden. They may fantasize about someone who would finally see them for who they are, without demanding explanations. They may dream of speaking without being judged, of being known without being simplified. But the mask is difficult to remove. Once the lone prophet is born in the psyche, it does not easily die. It becomes a guardian, a protector, a symbol of survival in a world that once failed to listen. And though it may offer dignity in solitude, it also costs the individual something vital, the spontaneous, childlike openness that allows real human connection to bloom without the armor of role or identity. The path of the intuitive introvert is one of immense depth, beauty, and inner wisdom, but it is not without danger. Beneath the quiet exterior lies a mind in constant motion, drawing meaning from places others never even look. And yet, this very gift, this piercing intuition, carries a dark weight when left ungrounded. The isolation that once felt safe becomes a silent torment. The images that once offered insight begin to take control. The identity that once provided purpose slowly becomes a mask, separating the soul from the world it quietly longs to belong to. This warning is not a condemnation. It is a call to awareness. A reminder that inner vision, no matter how powerful, must be balanced with presence. That solitude must be touched by relationship. That insight must return to earth to serve life, not escape it. You are not broken for feeling deeply. You are not lost for needing space. You are in danger if your inner world becomes your only home. To walk this path is to live at the edge of brilliance and madness, solitude and connection, insight and illusion. But there is a way through. It begins not by rejecting your depth, but by honoring it, without letting it possess you. You are not here to be the world's silent prophet, hidden in shadows. You are here to be fully human, to see the unseen, yes, but also to return with what you found, to speak it, to live it, to share it, because the greatest truth is not the one you carry alone in silence. It is the one you learn to bring back, transformed into light for others to walk by too.